I wanted to kick it off with your latest book, Same as Ever. So you've been, I just, like, it's funny, I was actually asking people yesterday saying, what is it about Morgan Housel? Like, what questions do you want me to ask? And he's like, how does he keep creating hits? He's like Jay-Z in such a short period of time.
A lot of similarities.
Yes, yes. So with Same as Ever, I want to start with the central premise. How consistent is human behavior across time?
I think you have to separate what is going to change and what isn't. And there's more things that are going to change. The next recession, the next war, the next pandemic is never like the last one. And so that's why forecasting is so hard in finance and politics. When's the next recession? Nobody can do it consistently, do it well, because finding out what's going to change is so damn impossible. But there's a whole list of things that never change. How people respond to the next recession, whenever it's going to come, how they respond to greed and fear and risk, it's been the same for thousands of years and will be the same for thousands of years from now. So I just think it was a better way to think about the future. Like, rather than fooling yourself into thinking you know what's going to change, focus on what doesn't. It's such a simple idea, but I think it doesn't get a lot of attention because what is going to change is so exciting. That's what's exciting to talk about, and it's going to have huge consequences, where focusing on all your attention on, well, greed and risk and fear, that never changes, so just focus on that, is not as exciting, but I think it's a much more accurate way to think about the future.
Yeah. So when you think about writing these stories, I mean, I power through your books. Right when they come out, I get it, and it's an instant read, like from start to finish. And it's because you're such a beautiful storyteller. In an industry that's filled with numbers and data and complexity, you have the ability to make, to the end investor, a very simple process, and you tie it back to history. What's your kind of thought process in content creation and how you go through that?
I think it was two things. One, like, the storytelling idea was just survival as a writer. If you're a finance writer and every day you wake up and say, here's what the Dow did today, you're out, you're done. That's not interesting. You have to tell a story just to survive and get people's attention. And so if you can tell, particularly a finance story, which is so analytical, if you can tell a story about investing, but it's a story that has nothing to do with investing, it's about biology, it's about politics, you'll get people's attention. So it was just survival. I also think it gets you closer to the truth, because all money management, investing, personal finance, it's just the whole field is how people behave with money. It's all behavior. And so behavior applies to everything. It applies to medicine. It applies to everything. And so if you can learn a lesson about how people respond in all these other fields and then apply that back to investing, not only is it more interesting, it gets you closer to the truth. And so that's why I think it was fun for me. I never wanted to just write data. It's important. Data is, of course, very important, but it was never that interesting. But if you can turn finance into the study of how people behave with money, I think it's more interesting for the client, it's more interesting for you, more interesting for the reader, and it gets you closer to the truth.
Yeah. So this audience is majority financial advisors, financial professionals, right? You speak to an audience of everyday people. What are some practical steps you could provide the audience here to think about how to get or translate your messaging into their own ways to help their clients?
Well, I think one of the worst things about finance in general is the overarching idea and philosophy that there is one answer, that there is a truth of how you should invest your money, or how you should spend your money, what you should do. Because it's so analytical, people are like, well, what does the spreadsheet tell me I should do? And that's the right answer. But there's not. Like, how I invest and spend my money might be totally different from you. Not because one of us is right or wrong, it's just everyone's a little bit different. And so I think that's probably the single biggest flaw with modern finance, is the search for one answer. And I think as an advisor or as yourself, the idea of figure out what works for you, what makes you feel good, what helps you sleep at night, that's the right answer for you. That's probably the most important thing in behavioral finance.
When you think about your own portfolio, how do you think, does everything you learn, does it change over time as you start to write a new book or you do research on it? Or are you just kind of...
Yeah, I used to be all Vanguard, and now it's all shitcoins. So it just, it evolved. No, it has maybe it's evolved over the years, but it's still very simple. The variable that I want to maximize for is just endurance. Because I always say, like, if you can be average for an above average period of time, you win. You're going to end up in the top probably 5% of investors if you can earn average returns for an above average period of time. So then you're focusing all of your effort and your thought on endurance. How can I just make sure that I'm never forced out of the investments that I own? Because if I can own them for 30 or 50 years, everything else is going to work itself out. And so that's my main focus. It has nothing to do with, I'm an index investor, but not because I think nobody can beat the market. I do, and people have, and will continue to do it. But I think you can actually earn your alpha, it's weird to say it that way, through time and endurance. Rather than trying to earn a higher annual return, you try to earn decent returns for a very long period of time.
But humans are irrational.
Yes, which is why most people won't be able to do it, which is why if you can just hang on for 30 years and do nothing intelligent, you'll end up in the top 5%.
Yeah.
Because everyone else is going to cut their hands off in the process.
But all right, so dealing with clients, right, everyone here, how do you manage that where people watch the markets, they're watching CNBC, they're listening to Bloomberg, and every day is this, that, this future's ending, and you are stay consistent, long-term, tell a story. How do you actually translate that into client engagement? How would you suggest that for this?
I think audience? So I've followed markets every day. What's the market doing today? I've done that for 20 years or something. But it doesn't cause me to take actions to do it. I think it's fascinating to see, oh, the Dow's down 400 points. What's going on? What's the headline? Because I think it's interesting. I think it's like markets are a window into how people behave and operate. But if you are using that media diet to go make a change to your portfolio, that's when it's dangerous. Yeah. So I think it's fine if you have clients who want to know why the market's doing this. When's the Fed going to cut? What's going to happen? That's all fascinating stuff. It's only dangerous when you're taking action with it. And I think there's also a thing where this is back to what the spreadsheet says you can do versus what people actually should do. I think if the spreadsheet says you should be, this should be your perfect asset allocation, 60-40, 80-20, whatever it is. I think there's a lot of people for whom it's like, no, you should actually be way more conservative because, look, let's say you're 50% cash and bonds. That might not make any sense on the spreadsheet. But given your personality of overreacting every single time the market falls 10%, even if you're not actually selling, even if you're just calling your advisor and panicking, you're going to do much better with a more conservative allocation if you can actually stick with it for a long period of time. And there's so much like fiddling with like trying to add basis points of return when if you panic once over the next 30 years, that's a permanent scar you're never going to recover from. And so that's where I actually think most people should probably be slightly more conservative than they are. Because most people don't really understand or are in denial about how they're going to respond during those moments of terror.
But, all right, so you bring up a good point, right? So you think about expectations and then happiness, right? And you talk about this a lot. What is the difference between expectations and reality when it comes to investing?
I think you can, well, the one that's so clear, and this is particularly for young people, but even seasoned investors, if you ask them, what do you expect your annual returns to be over the next 10 years? Young investors, some of them will tell you 35% per year for the next decade. And even a lot of like older, experienced investors, 15, 20%. Like, it's so far from what you are likely to earn. And then, so you have a situation where the actual returns are much less than you expected, even if historically they're great. You're an 8% per year, you're winning, you're doing great. But if you expected more, you're so much more likely to want to take more risk. Mm-hmm. That's when you're like, oh, maybe we should add this triple levered ETF and like leverage up here, just because you have unreasonable expectations of what you're going to earn over time. And the opposite is true. Like historically, last 100 years, S&P 500 adjusted for inflation, 6 to 7% per year. If your expectations are 5% real, every year that's ahead of that, you're stoked. You're great. And you're going to take less risk for it, which is going to give you more endurance to keep going. So it feels like so many people think that being conservative is like giving up or like, oh, I'm scared, I don't want to take risk. I actually think it's the opposite. Like the more you have that gap, the less likely you are to do something stupid in the pursuit of returns that you don't deserve and are not going to earn.
Yeah. So is the secret just to invest like an optimist and be patient?
Yes, but easier said than done, of course. Yeah. And it was like this for me, everyone. Like, how did I feel in March 2020 when the world's melting down? Terrible, of course. Like, it's so much easier said than done. And I think the only way to understand how you're going to respond in the next crisis is looking at what you did in the last crisis and using that as a proxy for what's going to happen next time. Because most people do not learn from their mistakes. You're like, oh, I panicked last time, but I won't next time. I learned no, yes, you will. It's the same emotions will come rushing back. And a lot of people learned from Lehman Brothers about what it's like to experience a financial crisis. But then for COVID, it was completely different. It was a pandemic that your kid's school was shut down and you might die next week. It was totally different. So people really, I think, don't have a good sense of how they will respond in the moment.
Yeah, well, I think that's where you're really elegant with, because you tie in history. So like, how important is understanding history when it comes to managing the realities of the present and in the future to not make irrational decisions?
Well, there's this great quote. I forget who said it, but the quote was...
Somewhat important, though. Somewhat important.
The quote was, everything feels unprecedented when you haven't engaged with history. So it's so easy to think like, oh, this recession, this bear market, this never happened before. This national debt's never happened before. Yes, it probably has, and we dealt with it, and life went on. Maybe it wasn't easy. Maybe a lot of people got washed out, but the more you study history, the more you realize it's the same movie over and over again. And that it can be scary, it can be comforting, but I think when you do that, it forces you to pay attention to those behaviors that never change. We've had so many different recessions, so many different financial crises. The behaviors are the same every single time. The details are different, but I think the more you study that, the more you become comfortable that, look, things might be bad, they might be dangerous and risky, but it's not unprecedented.
Yeah. So when you think about happiness in general, does money buy happiness?
I think it can. It can also buy complexity, and complexity can lead to unhappiness. I think that's really I think there are a lot of people, very wealthy people, who spend a lot of money who are very happy because of it. And there are some poor people who don't spend a lot of money who are very happy with it. It's whether you're using it as a tool. I think money is leverage to enhance what you're already doing. And some people, if they're already miserable, they already have bad relationships, they're in a bad marriage, they hate their job, money is just going to leverage that. And it's going to make them more unhappy from that. And there's some people who are already content and happy, and their spouse loves them, and their kids are well balanced, and they have great hobbies. And even if they're poor, they're going to wake up happier in the morning. There's some evidence with this that if you are already a happy person, money can make you happier. If you are already a miserable person, more money will not make you happier. So it's just enhancing what you already are.
So it's compounding.
Yes.
Why is compounding, the power of compounding, so misunderstood?
Well, I'll use the example that I stole from Michael Batnick many years ago. He said, if I ask you, what is 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8? Everyone can figure that out in 3 seconds. But if I said, what is 8 times 8 times 8 times 8? Your head explodes. You can't, people just can't think about that kind of growth. We're not made to think about growth in that way. And so that's why it's always counterintuitive how big the results can get. So in Psychology of Money, I use the example that 99% of Buffett's net worth came after his 65th birthday, which is it doesn't make any intuitive sense. Yeah. But and a lot of people will read that and say that can't be true. I'm like, no, it's absolutely true, because the results are just always not intuitive. Mm-hmm. So it's easy to underestimate where the results come from. Are the results of doing well in the market, does it come from annual returns or just lots, good annual returns, or lots of mediocre returns? Mm-hmm. It's always just lots of mediocre returns. So people end up focusing all of their effort into saying, how can I outperform the market this year? When it's like, no, that's honestly not what's going to make that big of a difference. It's just, can you keep it going forever? I'll keep repeating that, but that's why it's so important. It's just because it's never intuitive.
Yeah. I just want to remind everyone in the crowd, if you want to ask questions too, you could log into Slido and ask it. We'll probably have 5 minutes or so. Actually, there's one question here I wanted to get to because I think it's important. When you do some of your research, what is your favorite authors, bloggers that you consistently follow or track?
We'll give you two non-obvious ones, because obviously Josh, Barry, Michael, Ben, Nick, I've admired them for decades, of course. I think some of the best modern writers, there's a U.S. historian named Jay Winnick, W-I-N-I-K, who is, I think, one of the best writers out there. And he writes, it's like academic history about the Civil War and stuff. Maybe that's not your topic, but his ability to tell a story around it is completely unprecedented. I think he's so good at it. Another writer named Robert Kirsten, who wrote a book, Shadow Divers, and a book about Apollo 8, I think it was. Again, I've never seen someone just craft a paragraph as well as him. So I always love that. Even if it's not your topic, I think just appreciating the art of good communication and the art of good storytelling, I love it. The other one I always talk about, Doris Kearns Goodwin, the very well-known presidential historian. Some of her books are 800 pages, and there's not a single wasted word. Every word needs to be there. And so the key to good writing is just brevity, just making your point in as few words as possible, but that does not mean short. Like, she's writing a 900, 800-page book, and it's very brief. It's very succinct. And so just making your point in as few words as possible, even if it's very long form, that's the skill that I admire.
Is there a certain genre you follow, or is it just certain people?
No, I think it's definitely, there's certain authors who no matter what they write, I'll buy it, I'll read it. Yeah. But I think if you're interested in just how the world works and how people think, you can enjoy such a wide variety of topics if you're always just trying to fill in a puzzle piece of how do people think. The other thing that's important for reading is, I think I got this idea from Patrick O'Shaughnessy. He said you want a very wide funnel and a very tight filter. So you should be willing to start any book that looks slightly interesting, but feel free to slam it shut after 2 pages if it's not working for you. Like, you need a very tight filter of, like, look, this writing style is not going to work for me. I'm going to move on. And a lot of the reason people don't like reading is because they feel the obligation to finish every book that they start. And if you just unburden yourself from that and say, I'm going to try to start reading any book in the library looks interesting, but if it doesn't capture me in 3 pages, I'm going to move on to the next one. I think that's a good style.
It's so true. I'm guilty of that as well. I'll read it through, and it's like, oh, now I have to suffer through this.
And since you suffered through it, you don't want to read the next book because you view reading as a chore.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Shifting back to behavior, why is getting wealthy and staying wealthy why does it require such different skills?
They're very different skills. Getting wealthy requires taking a risk and being an optimist and being optimistic about yourself. And staying wealthy is the exact polar opposite. It requires like pessimism, conservatism, realizing your faults and realizing everybody else's faults. And there are a lot of people who are good at one of those, either getting wealthy or staying wealthy. And it's pretty rare that you see people who are very good at both. They have the skills needed to get wealthy and the skill needed to stay wealthy. It's actually a very rare thing. And so people always, they want to think of optimism and pessimism as binary. It's black and white. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? And I actually think to do well, you need to learn how to get both of them to coexist and live with each other. And be like, well, I'm optimistic in this way. I'm very pessimistic about this. And that's fine. It's not a contradiction. You got to get them together.
Yeah.
And it's pretty rare with money. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's jump to this other question. What is the single most important thing an advisor should share with a client at the outset of a relationship from a behavioral finance perspective?
I think if you're talking about investing, the most important data that exists, even not for just lay clients, but professionals, is the frequency of volatility in markets. And you look back in the last 100 years or whatnot, and even if you're a seasoned professional, you might underestimate how completely and utterly normal it is to have a 20% pullback. And that's important because if you're not aware of how frequent it is, every time it happens, it feels like the market's broken and something terribly bad happened. And usually it's like, no, this happens all the time. Yeah. And I think particularly with lay clients, they're going to view every 10% decline as you, advisor, you screwed up. Or politicians, policymakers, you made a mistake, you did something wrong. And 9 times out of 10, it's like, no, this is what happens all the time, completely normal and expected. That's probably the most important data.
Mm-hmm. I like this one here. I know we both have young kids. What is the best way to share your insights with your kids?
I think the answer is you don't need to because they're already paying attention whether you know it or not. And I always use the example of in politics, there is so much evidence that people inherit most of their political beliefs from their parents. There's huge correlation between what your parents believed and what you believe. And most of the time, your parents do not sit you down and say, let me teach you about politics. And this is why this is good, this is bad. But you pick it up over time. Just the little comments that you have when you're reading the newspaper, your kids are always paying attention to that and building a mental model. And it's the same with money. Of every time you say, we can't afford this, or we're going to buy more of that, or I got a raise, or whatever it is, they're building a mental model in their head of how money works. So I think the answer of how do you teach your kids about money is you just lead by example because they are definitely paying attention whether you know it or not.
But do you feel like, not everyone has the ability to, manage those types of relationships well? Some people are just, managing life and their kids naturally have to see that. So how would you unlearn some of your parents' behaviors, or how would you suggest to unlearn some of your parents' behaviors Because again, not many people have the luxury of deciding what that looks like.
Well, I think learning from your parents, you either pick up exactly what they did and you learn from it, or you are so disgusted by what your parents did that you do the exact opposite. You run the furthest direction away. It's usually one of those two things. I think one takeaway from that is just how influenced we all are by the dumb luck of where we were born, what generation, what country, and who our parents were. And so you see people who are making financial decisions that you think are crazy and bad and stupid, and it's easy to criticize and judge those people, and sometimes you should. But I think it's easy to underestimate that I believe what I do because of the experiences that I've had in life, and so do you, and so does everybody else. And a lot of those experiences were out of our control. And so it gives you permission to just, I'm going to make decisions about how I spend money based off of the world that I've seen through my own eyes. And because of that, I'm not going to judge how you do it or how anyone else does it, because we're all just doing the best we can with what we've learned. And I think it just makes you a little bit less cynical about all the bad decisions that you see other people making. That if someone, in your eyes, they're investing wrong, they're spending money wrong, well, it makes perfect sense to them, most likely.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a need for education and whatnot. It's not that, but I think when you realize, like, oh, it makes sense for them, and this makes sense for me. And you could criticize a lot of things that I do with money, but it works for me. Yeah. And this is what I want to do. And hopefully I learn more, and I might do different things in the future as I learn more, but this works for me right now, even if other people might disagree with it.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it goes back to your earlier point of not managing through the spreadsheet, right? Everything might say this, but yet understanding the behaviors and the backgrounds of your clients actually really do matter.
Yeah, you can use money as a tool to live a better life, or as something where you're just maximizing the inputs in a spreadsheet. And I think when you frame it like that, it's obvious. Like, okay, what I just did, this financial decision doesn't make sense on the spreadsheet, but it made me and my family happier. And is there any value in that? I think that's a big point.
Yeah. All right, we're a minute left. We're going to hit some predictions. What do you see as the biggest opportunity in wealth management over the next decade?
Well, I think in the last 30 years, it's been this movement away from financial advisors as information gatekeepers, which is what they were before 2005 or thereabouts, where if you were a local dentist and you wanted information about investing, you had to go to an advisor, or what they called stockbrokers back then. Yeah. And they were information gatekeepers. And that's almost completely out now. There's no, like, all the information that is needed to do well is available for free for everybody. And so the value add for advisors, I think, really drifted more towards helping people understand their goals, their risks, tax planning, all of those things, away from information gatekeeping. And I think the advisors who understood that early are doing phenomenal right now. And the advisors who still think that they are the information gatekeeper won't exist in the next 5 or 10 years. Yeah. So it just depends what you think your value add is. And moving away from portfolio management and information, more towards, like, I'm just going to help you understand who you are and try to manage that emotional baggage that you bring. That's where all the value is.
Well, we're over time. Morgan, thank you again for coming in, especially such short notice. I always learn so much from
you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Morgan Housel.
Thank you.